Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. Fashion is a $2.5 trillion global industry, but with significant carbon emissions, water usage, and waste contributing to its ecological footprint, the environmental impact of what we wear is immense. With climate change an ever more pressing issue, the industry faces mounting pressure to reduce its environmental impact and adopt more sustainable practices. The State of Fashion 2024, an annual report compiled by the Business of Fashion and McKinsey & Co., asked executives to identify the biggest challenges and opportunities in the industry's year ahead. 12% cited sustainability as a principal opportunity for 2024. Another 12% named it as a top challenge. The report also found that 87% of fashion executives think sustainability regulations will impact their businesses in 2024. Our guest today is Sarah Kent, Chief Sustainability Correspondent at the Business of Fashion. Sarah has been at the forefront of reporting on how the fashion industry can reduce its carbon footprint and how climate change is reshaping the sector. She led the creation of the BOF Sustainability Index, a comprehensive tool for assessing the sustainability performance of major fashion companies. In this seminar, we'll discuss all of that, as well as the emergence of a new style of fashion journalism that's prepared to chronicle both the industry's changing inputs and outputs in response to climate change. That's the briefing. Let's begin.
Welcome to our audience here. Welcome to Sarah Kent. Welcome to our online audience. This is a collaboration between the Reuters Institute for Journalism and the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, which is a part of the Reuters Institute and the Said Business School. I want to start by saying a big thank you to Said to create this space for a conversation like this. I think many of you in the room are sort of in an incubation phase, if you will, and you're going to go on to become business leaders and entrepreneurs. And it's great that you're thinking about that with a sustainable lens. Someone just mentioned that they're not into journalism, but they're into fashion. Some are into journalism and maybe not into fashion, and maybe there are others who are into climate and not into either. So I'm hoping that within those three categories, we've got a Venn diagram going, and there should be enough to cover. Sarah, welcome. You're sort of a girl of the hood. You know Oxford well, but you're on this side of the conversation today, so it's great to have you. I think it would be very interesting for everyone to know a little bit more about what you and your organization do, because it's quite different, and how you approach fashion and fashion reporting.
Right, so I work for a publication called The Business of Fashion, which is a trade publication focused on, well, it really does what it says on the tin. It's focused on covering everything to do with the business of fashion. And within that, I cover sustainability, which can cover the gamut of issues from climate, environmental impact, to labor, social impact, corporate governance issues. So it's a very broad topic. But we're a relatively new publication. We started in the last 15 years.
Okay.
And we're one of only quite a small number of places where I think you can go and get real business coverage of the fashion industry. You know, there's a huge amount written about fashion in many, many different places. But a lot of it is really focused on the glitz, on the glamour, on the consumer side of things, which is great. But this is a multi-trillion-dollar industry that spans from, you know, the stuff that's grown, raw materials, through manufacturing and processing, through the way we live, the way we shop, the way we buy. So there's a huge impact on, you know, business across the supply chain and people, and it deserves to be covered that way. And so that's what we do.
Yeah. And just for context, as you mentioned, it's trillions of dollars, and there is a pretty clear climate impact here. Some of the data shared with the European Parliament points to, what, 10% in terms of global emissions? Is it there? Is it higher?
It's probably lower. It's probably between sort of, the estimates range from sort of 2 to 8%. 10 is at the higher range.
Okay.
Part of the problem is that the data is really rubbish. But it's substantial, and you know it's not that's the emissions impact. But you know the EU has been trying really hard to regulate the fashion industry more, and one of the reasons why is that in their analysis of sort of climate impact writ large, it counts as one of the top 4 worst industries within the European Union. So it's very significant.
Yeah. And you made an interesting foray into this particular space of journalism because you were coming in from reporting on oil and gas that might have slightly larger numbers. How did that happen?
Yeah, it was a bit of a transition. I was an oil reporter for about 10 years with the Wall Street Journal, which was so interesting. I covered markets, I covered OPEC, I covered sort of big oil companies, so kind of did the whole spectrum of different ways you could cover the oil sector and learn a huge amount. But I moved to cover fashion about 2019, and at the time I was based in Europe, and the ESG conversation was really heating up with investors in Europe at that time, and Shell and BP in particular were coming under a lot of pressure to start talking about how they were going to tackle their emissions, what plans they were going to put in place for climate transitions. And I found this really interesting and wanted to write more about it. But from a US perspective, the narrative was very different. Trump was in power. The country just pulled out of Paris. Exxon and Chevron did not care at all. And so it was quite difficult to kind of pitch these stories that were coming from quite a European cultural standpoint to editors in New York, and I was finding that quite frustrating. And at the time, my first ever boss had moved to run the New York office of the Business of Fashion, and he sort of said, look, this is a big issue for our industry too. Come and write about it for us. And so I did.
And I'm glad you did, because you went on to do really special things there. Let's just analyze for a bit, though, the point that you made earlier. The data is rubbish. What about, on a scale of 0 to 10, the quality or the amount of journalism that's actually looking at fashion as an industry or a business with a climate lens versus covering this from a lifestyle approach and the glossy HDSI from FT and all the other weekend treats?
So there are really fantastic reporters out there who are covering this very closely. So the stories are there, but you have to dig a bit to find them. And far more often, you get a much glossier picture, even in the business publications. And maybe for every one sort of clear-eyed, sharp, analytical piece about this industry that you would find, you'll find 15 to 20 much frothier stories, even when they are addressing this topic. And if you search for fashion and sustainability, the likelihood is you'll find a sort of 5 top brands to buy if you want to shop sustainably before you'll find a more analytical piece about impact and business.
Yeah. What do you say it would take to change that? Some of the feedback we get when we speak to journalists covering climate is that the problem is often at the top. There's not enough interest at an editorial level to engage with more climate coverage, or at least to deepen climate understanding. When it comes to fashion, is it a problem in the newsroom, or is it a problem with the industry?
I think that's quite a complex one to unpack, because there is a lot more coverage across all fashion-focused publications of sustainability, even through a consumer lens. And I think you've seen quite a few consumer-facing publications try to engage much more with this, largely because it's something that consumers are more engaged with. It's much more part of the cultural conversation, and you see people wanting to understand more about the way they shop and its impact. The problem is, how do you make that, how do you write these stories for a consumer who doesn't necessarily want to open up their glossy magazine to where they want to figure out what they want to wear today and read an essay on Scope 3 emissions.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real challenge to make this engaging and make people want to read about that. And I know I hear that from people who work in other newsrooms too. How do you make people click on the climate stories? It's really challenging.
Yeah. Is that a problem that's more acute when it comes to talking about fast fashion? When I was sort of going into what we could discuss, I came across a really interesting description of fast fashion, which says essentially fast fashion helps sate deeply held desires amongst young consumers in the industrialized world for luxury fashion, even as it embodies unsustainability. There's a sort of a clear thread of shame that's being attached here, and I wonder if that works when you're trying to report on this.
To look at the idea that it's a fast, cheap fashion that is the problem,
and that the consumer is doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it becomes a very political question very, very quickly. And not just political from the sense that consumers don't want to feel like they're doing something wrong, but you also geographically you very quickly get into questions of sort of why should it be that consumers in developing countries don't get to shop and are being told that they should shop less when for decades those of us in Europe and the US have bought as much as we wanted. But when it comes down to it, yeah, the consumer does have some responsibility, and if you want to think about the way you consume more responsibly, then one relatively easy step is being more conscious in the way you buy fashion and thinking before you buy if it's something you really need and if it's something you really wear. And I do think it's that simple. Just it's not about price point. It's not about what brand you're shopping. If you're buying it, are you going to wear it? Are you going to wear it for a long time? If the answer is yes, then I think as a consumer you've sort of been responsible.
Made your peace with yeah.
The bigger question then comes back to the brands and the way they operate and the way the whole industry works, which is based on trying to get people to buy as much as possible, as fast as possible, because that's how you maximize your revenue.
Yeah.
And maybe this is the tension that you were getting at. If you've got an industry putting sort of billions of dollars into persuading consumers to shop more, can they really be blamed for falling foul of that? And I think that's a very fair discussion.
Yeah, and I'm sure people are sort of aware of it and have read enough about it, but that's the very nature of fast fashion, right? You're not working with 2 seasons, you're working with much, much shorter cycles, much more sort of output, just throwing it at the consumer. And have you seen in the last 5 years enough pushback on that model? And you can say no.
Well, I think it's interesting because the industry is not monolithic. So there is much more conversation now and even acknowledgement of the concept of degrowth, which I think in a lot of industries would be quite radical. But you can go into fashion forums and people will quite happily talk about the elephant in the room being that the industry needs to figure out a way to sort of keep making money without making more stuff. So that's one conversation happening. On the other hand, the most successful company in the industry at the moment is Shein, which has essentially taken this sort of fast fashion model to a new level and executed it faster, better, and more efficiently than anyone was doing it before. And that is extremely beguiling to a lot of investors and to a lot of people who are looking at the industry and seeing a new way to make more money.
Yeah, I want to unpack that one, but I want to do a very quick dipstick survey from the audience. How many people in the room have heard of Shein as a brand? Raise your hands. Very good. Only some stragglers. Let's unpack that one because, as you said, it's going IPO. When we were chatting earlier, that's hugely exciting for the size of this.
Yes.
But as a journalist, what are the kind of stories that I could explore when I wanted to report on Shein?
Shein is such a rich vein to unpack because there's so many different things to look at. Firstly, purely as a business, this is a company that's come in and disrupted quite a sleepy industry. The fashion sector was pretty slow to digitize. The luxury industry pretty much only got online because of the pandemic. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't find it that easy to shop online for luxury fashion. It has really lagged on the tech revolution, and Shein has come in with a very sophisticated digitized supply chain and shown the industry that it could operate so much more. Better is the wrong word because obviously it comes with negative impacts, but it could operate from a business perspective more efficiently than it is, and that has an evolution that Shein has really hammered home, and that is why it's eating the rest of the industry's lunch. It's also sort of really went into this idea of gamified shopping, where if you go on, we were talking about this earlier too, if you go on to Shein, there's pop-ups everywhere, there's always a sale, it's a countdown, it's really
It's 2 days to something. It's always 2 days to something.
It's 2 days, and it taps into, you know, parts of your brain that makes you want to shop. It's incredibly effective. So from, you know, the mechanics of retail, it's a fascinating story. Then, you know, this is a company that started in China, now based in Singapore, doesn't sell anything in China, but has become the most downloaded app in the US. It, you know, is eating the lunch of sort of the biggest mass fashion companies in Europe and America, and is this completely, has done this very, very quickly. So that is also fascinating, and it's private. So although it's listing now, there's relatively little known about it, which means everyone wants to know more about it. And then there's the environmental and social impact, because the company produces in, you know, thousands of factories in Guangzhou. There's been lots of reports about these factories having excessive overtime. There's been links to cotton from Xinjiang. The company produces so much, its environmental impact is high. And so this raises lots of questions, is just as you're looking at this new model that it seems to be working really well to generate profit and revenue, on the other side you have these huge big issues being raised. So there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah. Have you seen enough as well, and just for lack of a better term, in terms of the global south, global north divide while reporting on fashion, the fact that production is happening in one part of the world, consumption is until now largely happening in another side of the world. Are we talking about that enough or at all?
It is a huge issue, and it keeps coming up, especially from the point of view of how companies are going to deliver on their sustainability goals. Because primarily what you've had is big Western brands under pressure from investors and consumers and politicians setting these lofty climate goals, which they are only going to meet if the companies they rely on in their supply chain actually do the work to deliver on the results. Because fashion, as with many other industries, primarily its impacts happen in the manufacturing supply chain rather than with the brands themselves. And so the issue keeps coming up where brands will come and say, oh yeah, we want to deliver these emissions, but by the way, we're not going to pay higher prices for our clothes to be produced. Manufacturers, primarily in the global south, are increasingly beginning to speak up and say, this is ridiculous. You can't come to us and expect us to make costly changes to, you know, get rid of coal-fired boilers or, you know, install more efficient machinery, whilst continuing to say we need to deliver everything at the same price. And by the way, if our prices go up, you're just going to go next door to another country where they are perhaps not doing these things because really what you care about is cheaper prices.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk about accountability and the index that you sort of drove. But before that, I was looking at some of the global trends that you mark out for the year. And it's quite interesting that the number one trend there is geopolitics. Do you want to sort of explain that to us?
Well, I mean, I think it's the uncertainty geopolitically has a huge impact on the industry, whether it's in terms of how it affects consumer sentiment and buying power because of the impact on the economy, but also the diversions in the Red Sea have changed how long it takes for products to get to market, which in a fast fashion world has a huge impact. And if you're not going to, so you either then have to divert your shipments, which takes longer and will cost a bit more, or you fly them, which costs much more. And so I think it's a misconception, the idea that geopolitics wouldn't have the same impact on fashion as it would on any other company. The other example is US-China tensions. Huge impact. So much of the industry has had to shift manufacturing from China to other countries to try and manage this. The US ban on imports from Xinjiang has had a dramatic impact on the industry. 20% of the world's cotton comes from China, and most of that is produced in Xinjiang. And
the tariffs
frankly,
don't help, yeah.
The brands don't have traceability to understand where their stuff comes from. So it has a huge impact on the way the industry operates.
What was a bit ironic for me was that the number 2 spot went to climate urgency, and the number 3 spot went to vacation mode. It was a bit of a moment.
That tells you everything, really.
How do you marry the two? I mean, there's climate urgency, so I'm really glad it's on the list. And then there's vacation mode, saying this is going to be the year people sort of vacation with a vengeance, which means they're going to shop more and they're going to go out there, and you need to meet them where they are with your goods.
Well, but I think this also speaks to sort of and we haven't really talked about this yet, this is an industry, and it's not unique in this, where you've got companies increasingly making these very lofty public-facing goals and talking about how much they care, but fundamentally the day-to-day of the business is completely divorced from those longer-term goals, and that's how you end up with priorities like that, and also how you end up with the industry not making much progress towards the goals it set for itself.
Yeah. Let's talk about accountability in that context. And you launched something called the Sustainability Index, standard disclosure to the audience that's been paused over the last 2 years, I think. Tell me what the thought was behind it and what it is that you were looking to assess these companies around.
So the index really came about because I very naively thought that it would be a relatively simple task to sort of make some basic...
To rank them, did you? Just say it, come on.
It wasn't that wasn't how it started. So it all started because I'd been reporting on this story about the rivalry between Kering, which is the company that owns brands like Gucci and Yves Saint Laurent, and LVMH, which owns Louis Vuitton and other big luxury brands. They're the two biggest French luxury conglomerates. They have this big rivalry. And the reason why this related to sustainability was because back in, I think, late or mid-2019, the CEO of Kering was tasked by Emmanuel Macron to put together a fashion industry body ahead of the G7 to tackle sustainability. And he made this big announcement saying that he was doing this and announced a bunch of big partners who were all coming together, and it was the, Chanel and Hermes and H&M and Inditex, and it was the first time you'd kind of had brands from all of these different spaces coming together on this issue. LVMH notably did not join this. And later on, sort of threw some shade at Kering, saying, the quote was along the lines of, we do acts, not pacts. And so I did the story kind of, analyzing this rivalry and trying to break down, how LVMH performed versus Kering. And it was actually very, very difficult to make a comparison. So I thought, this would be a fun task over Christmas. I'll just go away and try and sort of do some basic comparisons of a few of the biggest companies. And as I started to try and do that, I realized it was extremely difficult. And this was where the idea for the index came from. Could we put together a ranking that would allow you to compare? And I think the first one we did was just the 15 biggest brands by stock market listing at the time. And this became very complicated very quickly because then we had to decide what our metrics were. We put together a panel of experts, we consulted with them, and we came up with 6 different categories, but within each category we had over 100 different sort of things that we were looking at ultimately to try and assess how these companies were doing. And the way we thought about it was to sort of work backwards from 2030 and say, okay, a lot of these companies have said we want to meet some form of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if they're aiming for that by 2030 and we map backwards, what are the steps that they need to do in order to achieve these? And we took this kind of these sort of questions that we came up with. We looked at all of the publicly available documentation that companies have put out. And we used that to sort of decide whether or not they qualified for each sort of little question. They got a point if they did. Each company got sent their individual rankings to tell us if we'd missed something, and if they could show us a publicly available source where we were wrong, then we changed it, and this was how we put together the ranking. Yeah. It was extremely. I learned a lot. It was very interesting. It was not particularly easy to make comparisons. and it took a really long time. But what we came up with was, and at the time this was quite rare, but more entities are doing this now, was just a clear ranking of those first 15 companies saying, this is how we think they're doing. Yeah. And, got people talking, which was great.
Yeah. You've got the newsroom, and then you have the industry, and then you have this massive mountain called advertising.
Yes.
Do you get the sense that luxury fashion often gets a free pass where fast fashion doesn't? Because when you're flipping through the magazine, you're not looking at Shein.
Luxury fashion definitely gets an easier ride than fast fashion. I could not publish a story saying it was because of advertising spend. I don't have the evidence to show that. And I think it probably is more complex than that. I think that, beyond advertising spend, the luxury industry has a very, very sophisticated way of talking about itself and tamping down on what otherwise might be critical voices. And part of that is that they don't really engage with criticism of themselves. And they keep this very strong narrative, which is that, well, because we are expensive, this could not possibly be our issue. This is a mass market. This is about volume. This is about low-cost production in places where we don't produce. Yeah. And there are elements of that there are elements that are true to that, which is, generally speaking, luxury brands do not produce as much stuff, and they do have more production in countries with stronger labor laws. However, they also spend the most money on advertising that is designed to get us all to shop more. They also, many of them now, are fundamentally fast fashion themselves. There used to be 4 seasons. Now you've got 4 core seasons, plus a pre-season, plus a cruise season, plus random drops. They are capitalizing on this model too. Just because you produce in Italy does not mean that you produce ethically. Armani got into a lot of trouble earlier this year because its production arm was found to be using a manufacturer who was subcontracting to companies in Italy that were essentially using migrant workers on 2 to 3 euros an hour in terrible conditions. So luxury is not immune to these issues. It's just much better at painting a picture that looks nicer.
Yeah, I think I read a really interesting term to describe it, which is how do we de-fetishize the consumption and the sort of narrative around fashion. I feel like I won't get an exit through the door if I don't use the words AI in a conversation. But is that sort of a space that looks more positive in this AI and fashion story versus AI and many other things?
It depends how you look at it.
Okay.
There are certainly areas where people are excited about AI in fashion. That it can be used as a tool to amplify creativity, and there's definitely areas, again, because the industry is really not digitized at all, where you could sort of use data gathering, for instance, around climate impact or even just inventory management. AI could be extremely useful, but as with every other industry, there are the same concerns about job loss, what happens when the machines take over, and what it means for a creative industry if suddenly you want to rely on a computer to design your clothes instead of a person, or for models if you're just using AI-generated imagery instead of a real person to model your clothes.
Yeah, fair point. We're going to open up for questions. I have some online with the room. Just raise your hands. We'll try and get a mic to you. Before that, before we start getting the questions in, I want to draw in some expert opinion from our expert opinions. 2 of them are seated right here, Diego Arguedas-Ortiz and Catherine Dunn, both of whom are part of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. They run that space. Many journalists who are part of that network know these 2 as very familiar faces. Shall we start with Kat, since let the lady go first, and then we'll go to Diego? I think another mic is reaching you.
Hello? Should I just, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Very
everyone,
good.
I'm not very good at the technology. Yeah, my response was just like, this is an amazing beat. Like, if you're going to be a business journalist, you've really got it all. You've got, geopolitics, you've got climate, you've got something consumers are interested in. And I think I did have a little question, if that's what I could use for my response time, which is, given the fact that also maybe, I think it's fair to say, and this isn't Sarah spicily saying it, but I think it's us saying it, because we always look for fashion journalists to join the OCGen, is that there's not that much competition out there really for very serious business coverage of the fashion industry that also takes, I wouldn't say that. I mean, there's lots of great coverage out there for people who love fashion, but treating it as an industry and really holding the companies to account and really asking them good questions. So what is an area of climate and fashion journalism crossover that you think is criminally undercovered and you would like some more competition on this particular
Is it
area?
cheating to say all of it?
Yes, it is cheating. You have to pick one.
Criminally undercovered. It is all of it. I think, and there has been fantastic work on this, particularly by one writer called Alden Wicker lately, but the chemical usage and impact does not get as much attention as it should, and I think that's partly because it's really hard to understand, and also there's so much debate still over what the chemical impacts are. But, for instance, until very recently, PFAS forever chemicals were all over our fashion. Anything waterproof probably has PFAS on it. Gore-Tex, that's all PFAS. And there's lots of other really nasty chemicals in the industry, and that does not get as much coverage as it should.
Diego.
Sarah, it's great to have you here. Just a plug, she's an alumni of the OCGN, and we're really happy to have you here, like in person. The OCGN is virtual. I am struck by the ability to transfer skills from like business journalism and oil journalism specifically to fashion. And I love that about climate journalism, how you can just take one part of where you're covering like one beat and say, okay, tomorrow I'll just take my skills and see the climate angle somewhere else. And this applies also the other way around. Like Steph Spiro, who's used to be environmental editor at the Daily Mirror, I want to say. She's now the political correspondent over there. So it's like the other way around, went from like climate to politics. So I really love this idea of like, how do you move around beats? And I also have a question, which I think we haven't covered much, the impacts on the industry itself. And I know you've covered this, and you must know more about that than I do, and I want to hear on you. But seeing like what happened in South Asia and East Asia with heat recently, droughts, affect supply chain, like how are we thinking about impacts on the industry itself and how they are adapting to the changing climate, or not?
They are not adapting.
Just the water consumption, right?
Just water consumption is huge, but I think it's really interesting because fashion is an incredibly short-term industry, and this is one of the big differences from oil, where you start a project that's going to be 5-10 year project. Fashion, it's a season, and the seasons are getting shorter, and so it's quite hard when you're planning for such short seasons to then think about long-term impacts and long-term planning, and so the climate impact is kind of going under the radar, but it's here and it's getting worse. I just did a story about the heat waves in Southeast Asia. And the impact on labor is huge. It's really hot in the factories. You're getting a lot worse heat stress. But also, when it gets to sort of 45, 50 degrees, machines stop working. And you can't control the quality of fabric when you're trying to dye it. And productivity comes down. So this is not just a labor issue. This is a real economic issue. And it's just that you're getting these short, sharp shocks at the moment, which allows it kind of to fall under the radar. But as you get longer lasting, higher heat levels, that is going to become more acute. It's also having more impact further down the supply chain on cotton, where you see parts of Pakistan and India, for instance, where the regions where you can grow cotton are shrinking. But because that's a commodity and it's so fungible, again, it's not showing up in the industry in the way you might expect it to be. It's the same issue why, manufacturers are so anxious about making adaptations or mitigation steps that would cost more money, because the industry is just going to go somewhere else where they can get it for the same price or cheaper. And that's what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great point. As is tradition, we will pivot to our journalists first. Let's see if there's any questions. Hagar, if we could get the mic to the lady with the scarf. And Hagar, if you could just say a word about where you're from, the publication you work with. It's on now, I think.
Hi, can you hear me?
No, it's muted.
Hello, hi. My name is Hagar. I'm part of the journalism fellowship here at Oxford, and I'm a reporter for Israeli newspaper Haaretz. I wanted to ask if there is any specific piece of legislation that fashion companies or their lobbyists are particularly concerned about.
Yes, lots of it. This is an industry that has been extremely underregulated because, it's fashion. Why would anyone pay attention to it? And that has changed over the last few years. So there's, first of all, the sort of basic climate regulation that the EU is bringing in, or is leading the way on, in terms of requiring more due diligence and disclosure of reporting that will hit the biggest fashion companies, as they're having to deal with that now. More other elements are requiring the industry to figure out supply chains much more. So for instance, the EU Deforestation Act is going to hit leather and palm oil, which is more beauty, which is kind of adjacent. But companies are suddenly having to figure out where things come from in a way they really haven't before. The French have put in place pretty strict labeling laws for products now, which has got the industry a bit hot and bothered. But the biggest one that is in place already that has affected the industry is the US ban on goods from Xinjiang. Because the US is such a big market, they've impounded billions of dollars of products. And if your cargo gets seized, at best, that's a huge delay before it gets to the shop floor, and everything's moving so fast that delay probably means you can't sell at full price anymore. At worst, it gets tied up for ages. And then proving that your products don't have any links to Xinjiang is really hard.
Could we get a mic to the gentleman, and then I'll come to you, Laura. Here and then there. Thank you.
Hello. I think it's working. Thank you. My name is Osama.
Yeah, it's a bit odd, right, Osama? We're literally sitting one arm away from each other. Just say it loudly.
I think I can shout. It's okay. And my name is Osama. I'm from...
Yeah, 1 second. Wait.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. My name is Osama. I'm from Iraqi Kurdish. I'm working for the Kurdish news organization, Ruda Media Network. I think my question is about the bias. And the bias is, I think the world is not ready to see success from China. So you take TikTok, successful, let's ban it. 5G, let's ban it. Shein and Temu. And like almost every time there is a success coming from China, you would see this negative stories and this negative coverage of okay, what about the labor? What about the production, supply chain, and all these kind of questions? So I'm interested to see if you could tell if there is a bias from the newsroom, this Western-based newsrooms, and then when it comes to products, you're more likely to perhaps have a negative coverage. The question you asked about Shein, have you heard it? It's because of two reasons. One is lower prices, and second is from my point of view, it is negative coverage of and of course, there was this coverage, this story from the BBC about Temu, and then they asked the consumers. Consumers said because of the rise of the cost of living, actually they are not interested in all these kind of questions about the labor force and everything. It's just like, it's so much cheaper to have like something for Christmas. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Shall we do this? Shall we bunch a couple of questions and then take it? Laura had a question, the lady in green. Sorry, the lady behind you.
Thank you. My name's Laura. I'm from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in Sydney. My question was about waste, and I guess from your reporting, what do you think is the biggest thing that either the industry can do or be regulated on, or whether that's more from the recyclers' end? Certainly in Australia, a lot of our textile waste, which is basically clothes, it has been exported to Asia and Africa and just becomes these like wastelands of textiles that can't be reused. Do you see the responsibility for that staying with the manufacturers in the first place? And what's the biggest barrier, I guess, to having more of a circular economy for fashion?
Thank you. Do you want to take those two first? Or
Sure.
Yeah, go.
Great question on bias. I think there is a bias against the coverage of Shein does paint it as a villain very often in a way that isn't very nuanced. I don't think that's just about the politics. I also think it is, you've got a company that is very cheap and very fast, and it's a very easy narrative to make it a poster child for everything that's bad about the industry. Separately, because of the primarily tensions between the US and China, Shein has become part of that political bun fight, and that has also then shaped coverage. But I think in that context, it is legitimate to write about Shein in the context of those political tensions. And the questions around the company and its impact are also valid. So I think there's some complexity there. I think the company has been covered in too simplistic a way. So I think you're right, but also it's probably more nuanced than it is, than just saying simple bias. And then on waste, it's a big problem for the industry. Generally speaking, where it seems to be moving is that regulators are taking the view that this is the responsibility of the brands. And so you're seeing a lot of countries or even states look to bring in legislation that would extended producer responsibility rules, which would mean the brands have to pay some form of tax that is intended to help clean up the waste. Few problems, the primary one being that there isn't really any way to recycle old textiles at the moment. So you're sort of asking the industry to deal with something it doesn't have a solution for yet. The export of old clothes around the world is also quite complicated because it is essentially exporting our waste problem to other countries, but it's also quite a thriving trade. And so that there are whole economies that revolve around it, and different, you talk to different people of different perspectives on whether or not it's good or bad, depending on where they sit within those. Probably the biggest, what happens to clothes once they've been worn and used is one aspect of it. The other aspect of this that the industry likes to talk about even less is how much stuff it produces and never sells to begin with. And that's probably the first point where companies should be looking to try and sort of pull levers to shift the way they operate, because that is also waste for them. If they're making stuff and they can't sell at full price, that's cost. And if they can't sell it at all, that's even more cost. So that, there's a clear business case to be made for operating more efficiently, which is also where Shein is very interesting, because its model works where it makes small amounts of clothes, sees how they sell, and if they're selling well, makes more, which reduces the amount of excess inventory it ends up with a lot.
There's a really interesting related question online, and I want to take that and pose it to you. The writer says, "Hi Sarah, I report on the intersection of sports and climate. I'm struck by the waste every season in kit manufacturing. Can you touch on the prospect of recycling and upcycling as a solution?" Here's sport, and then there's...
Merch is a really interesting point. It should be possible. It should be, not necessarily fully circular, but there, especially most kits will be made of some kind of polyester. Yeah. There are new technologies that are sort of beginning to come to scale that means that those should be recyclable. It will probably be more expensive and a bit more effort than what teams are doing at the moment, and I'm sure it's not a central focus for most of them. But I think it is really interesting, and I'd be curious to know if it's something fans care about.
The lady up front.
It was mentioned that you wrote on oil and gas industry reporting there, and then transitioning into fashion. The inner workings of an arts or design-based organization versus the other industry. What were your core sort of strikingly different categories that you observed in the inner workings of these companies?
That is a great question. So oil and gas, obviously an industry of engineers, and they're very data-driven. And when they are very used to having very technical knowledge. And so typically, I think they were more prepared to sort of understand the sort of different challenges that they were working with when looking at sustainability. I think the fashion industry, it doesn't have, not just for this reason, it's many oil companies are much more vertically integrated. The fashion industry is very fragmented, so it's harder to kind of map and understand what's going on. But the sort of operational side that really is where the rubber hits the road on sustainability just hasn't been as big a focus for the industry, because it's much more about the design and, sort of create the fetishization and selling a dream, which is just a very different way of thinking about things and operating. And so, often, and this is still the case today actually, you will find that fashion companies put their sustainability initiatives under their marketing initiatives. And that is really how they approach the issue. It's like, how can we sell this to consumers? Which isn't necessarily the most effective way to change the way
call
your
it
industry.
Hypocrisy 101, but we won't. I think we can squeeze in one more question, and I want to take it from online. We talked about AR in the fashion industry, but there's another question saying, what about labels venturing into the crypto industry, launching NFTs like Dolce & Gabbana? How does that contribute to environmental sustainability?
Okay, full disclaimer, I have not covered this particular topic.
Fashion is an onion.
Fashion is an onion. I think that were the industry still going really big on NFTs, there are sort of lots of questions about the emissions associated with crypto and with that area. It appears at the moment that was a little, fashion got very excited about NFTs during the crypto boom, been much more quiet about them since. So maybe it will come back to the foreground, but I think for the time being, it's just not where the industry's focusing.
6:56. Let me squeeze one more in. The lady at the back there.
Thank you. Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much. My name's Sarah. I'm coming at it from the other side, I suppose. So I run a small underwear business based here in Oxford, and we are trying to be as sustainable as possible. So we tackle all of these challenges. There's a number in the fashion industry, and we're trying to do all of that. So we're organic, we're fair trade, we're regenerative, we're fully circular, we have a take-back model, and we donate pairs for every pair we sell. We're trying to grow and get awareness, and it's a bit of a question from you from the fashion side, and the business side. So we get a challenge saying, you're doing it, you're a B Corp, you're the highest scoring B Corp, but you're not a big enough brand to cover because we don't have that story behind it. And then we get the challenge on the business side saying you're not big enough, so we've got a degrowth model. And then they push back and say, you're not big enough. Where's your 10x growth strategy and your exit strategy? You're not big enough to cover on the business side to be a story either. How do you tackle that when you've got, when you're going up against this and say you can do it as a small business and as a fashion business if you give a shit, if you care? And how do you get that coverage to kind of say that there's beep that one out, sorry. Just your advice, I suppose, from the fashion and the business piece of it. How do you tackle it?
That is a really interesting question and a really difficult one. I don't know that I have a very satisfactory answer for you. I think you just have to keep pitching and keep trying. And I don't necessarily even know from a brand perspective that sort of I don't know how many consumers are going to read, that's how they're shopping. I think people are sort of being more influenced online now. So I don't know that pursuing as a brand coverage from sort of traditional publications is necessarily going to be that helpful, but also not my area of expertise. So, and for terms of being at it from the brand side.
Then some level it's not something we're missing. It's just, keep plugging away at it.
Yeah.
I know we've got just a couple of minutes, but I want to corner them for myself. Is there a story that you'd like to share with the audience here and the audience online, something that you read or you wrote or came out, from your stable that you think was such a power moment for this is the kind of story that we should be talking about in fashion journalism and sustainable fashion and sort of all of it, just bringing it together?
Oh, that is a big question. I'm trying to think what I've read recently. Because I don't want to give it. I think there is lots of really, really good journalism on this topic that is happening. You just have to dig for it. I'm trying to think of the one that I read most recently.
Or something that you watched. I mean, it could be either.
There are some really good documentaries. If you want to understand Shein, for instance, the BBC has done some really excellent documentaries. They also did one recently. It was pretty bleak on child labour in jasmine picking fields that are ending up in perfumes. So you find these, it's things that you really just wouldn't have a think about, but actually, it's everywhere. There's issues everywhere, and it's so interesting and rich and depressing. But some of those documentaries are fantastic. I would highly recommend.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. And can I say, I'm so glad that this conversation happened at the Said Business School. I don't think we'd get such an interesting mix from sort of entrepreneurs themselves and journalists and people interested in climate. A very warm round of applause, please, for our guest this evening. Thanks again. For those in the room, we can gather outside, and I'm sure you have more questions to Sarah, which you can pose to her. Thank you for joining in today.